The moment Lionel Collier saw the figure standing at his gate, his horse nearly threw him, because after 12 years of carrying the hollow ache of a woman he had never stopped loving, Emma Wallace was standing in his yard like something conjured from the most stubborn corner of his soul. But that is getting ahead of things, and a story like this one deserves to be told from its proper beginning, because 12 years is a long time, and the road that brought them both back to that sun-scorched gate in Redemption, Texas, in the autumn of 1887, was neither straight nor easy nor without its share of heartbreak. The year was 1875 when Lionel Collier first laid eyes on Emma Wallace, and he was 22 years old, lean and rough-handed from working his father's cattle ranch on the edge of the hill country, where the limestone bluffs caught the evening light and turned the whole world amber. He had ridden into the town of Maple Creek for supplies: flour, salt, boot leather, and nails, and had found himself standing in Hargrove's general store when the door opened, and in she walked with her mother, Margaret Wallace, a fine-boned woman from Georgia who had never quite made her peace with the dust of Texas. Emma was 19, and she had her mother's fine bones and her father's dark eyes, and when she moved through the store with that particular kind of unhurried grace, Lionel had knocked an entire shelf of tin cans to the floor and stood there red-faced while old Mr. Hargrove sighed at him. Emma had laughed, not unkindly, but freely, the way a person laughs when they are genuinely amused and have not yet learned to pretend otherwise. And she had helped him pick up the cans, and their hands had touched reaching for the same one, and neither of them had pulled away immediately. Her father was Robert Wallace, who ran the only law office in Maple Creek and who had strong opinions about property rights, cattle disputes, and who his daughter spent her time with. He was not a bad man. He was a practical one. He had come west from Georgia with the belief that the frontier was a place where a man could build something lasting, and he had in fact built something lasting: a reputation, a practice, a house with glass windows and a porch that faced the sunset. What Robert Wallace had not bargained for was the particular way his daughter's eyes would light up when a cowboy with sun-darkened skin and earnest brown eyes walked into a room. Lionel did not have much to offer in the beginning. His father's ranch was modest, carrying around 400 head of cattle on land that had been bought fair and paid off in full, which was more than many could say. But it was not the kind of establishment that impressed a man like Robert Wallace. Still, Lionel was persistent in the way that young men are when they have found something they believe in completely, and Emma was not the kind of woman to let her father's preferences override what she herself felt was true. They spent 2 years courting in that careful, public, half-chaperoned way that the times demanded: Sunday services and town socials and long evenings on the Wallace porch, where Margaret would sit with her sewing and pretend not to listen to their conversation. Though Lionel always suspected, she heard every word. He learned that Emma read voraciously, that she had opinions about everything from land reform to the treatment of the Comanche people who had been pushed off the hill country land that men like his father had settled, that she could ride as well as any man he knew, and that she made a venison stew that would make a grown man weep with gratitude. He loved her. He loved her in the absolute, bone-deep way that a person loves something they recognize as essential, the way you recognize water when you are thirsty or warmth when you are cold. He told her so on a Tuesday evening in May of 1877, standing in the shade of a live oak tree on the edge of her father's property, and she had looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that always seemed to be turning something over, examining it from every angle, and then she had said, quietly and without any flourish, that she loved him too. He had intended to ask Robert Wallace for her hand that very summer. What he had not intended was for the fever to come. It started in June, a sickness that moved through the hill country like a slow and merciless tide, hitting the outlying ranches first. Lionel's father, Thomas Collier, took ill in the second week of July, and his mother, Clara, was fighting it herself by the end of the month. Lionel worked the ranch alone for 6 weeks straight, nursing his parents through the worst of it, losing a hand named Daltrey who had worked for the Colliers since Lionel was a boy. When the fever finally released its grip on the family, Thomas Collier was alive but diminished. A man who had stood 6 feet and worked from sunup to sundown was now someone who tired easily and coughed through the winter months. The ranch needed rebuilding. The cattle numbers had suffered. The finances were worse than they had ever been. Lionel had gone to see Emma in September after the immediate crisis had passed, and she had listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on his face. And when he had finished, she had said that none of it changed how she felt about him. He had believed her. He still believed her all these years later. The trouble was never about what Emma felt. The trouble was about what Lionel felt about himself, about what he was able to offer, about what kind of man asked a woman to share a life that was currently held together with rope and prayers. Robert Wallace had not been unkind about it when Lionel finally had the conversation with him in October of that year. He had been honest, which in some ways was harder. He had said that he respected Lionel's character, that he had seen the way the boy had handled the hardship of the summer with his head up and his hands working, but that Emma deserved stability. He had said that there was a man in San Antonio, a man named Gerald Ashworth, who was an attorney and a business partner of Robert's, who had expressed an interest in Emma's hand, and that while he was not going to force his daughter into anything, he was going to make sure she understood all of her options. Lionel had gone home and stared at the ceiling of his childhood room for 3 nights running. The offer came through a contact his father had a cattle drive heading north to Kansas, following the Kishom Trail, working for a man named Harlan Beck, who was known to pay his hands well and on time. It was hard, brutal work, months on the trail, sleeping rough, eating camp food, pushing cattle through the heat and the storms and the river crossings. But the pay was better than anything Lionel could make working his own land in its current condition, and Beck had hinted that, for a man who proved himself capable, there might be a permanent position managing one of his operations in Kansas. The plan had taken shape slowly and then all at once. Lionel would go north, earn enough to set things right on the ranch and have something real to stand on, and then he would come back and ask Emma properly, with enough behind him to make the argument that he deserved her. He had told Emma all of this at the Maple Creek train station in November of 1875. Though the drive itself would not begin until spring, he was leaving to meet Beck's outfit in Abilene and spend the winter learning the operation. Emma had stood on the platform with her dark hair pinned under a gray hat and her hands folded over the handle of her small bag, because she had come to see him off, and she had dressed carefully for it, the way you dress carefully for things that matter. Her expression had been one he had not entirely been able to read: love and worry, and something else underneath it, something careful and constrained, the way a person looks when they have made a decision they are not sure about. He had held her hands in both of his and told her he would write. He had told her he would be back inside 2 years, 3 at the outside. He had told her to wait for him. She had looked at him for a long moment with those dark, turning eyes, and then she had said, "Come back, Lionel." Not "I will wait," not "I promise," just "come back." He had gotten on the train. He had written as promised every 2 weeks for the first year. Emma had written back careful, warm letters that told him about the town, about the weather, about the book she was reading, and the argument she had with her mother about the new curtains, and the way the mockingbirds were particularly aggressive that spring. She never mentioned Gerald Ashworth. He never asked. The trail drive in the spring of 1876 had been everything he had been warned it would be and worse, and also, in some terrible way, magnificent. He had pushed cattle through flooded rivers and dust storms, and one night of lightning so fierce that the sky never went dark, and he had done his job and done it well, and Harlan Beck had noticed. The letters from Emma had slowed in the second year. Not stopped, slowed. Less frequent, shorter. with a quality he could not quite name but that sat in his chest like a stone. He had written back with increasing urgency, asking if she was all right, asking what was happening, and the answers he received were perfectly fine and told him almost nothing. The letter that changed everything arrived in Abilene in March of 1877, addressed in Emma's handwriting but written in a tone so careful and measured that he had known before he finished the first paragraph what it was going to say. Gerald Ashworth had asked for her hand. Her father had encouraged her to consider it seriously. She had been considering it. She did not know when Lionel was coming back. She had only his word and his letters, and letters were not a life, and she was 21 years old and her father was not in good health. She had written, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know, and because I believe that honesty, however painful, is a form of respect. I do not know what the right thing is. I am asking you to tell me what you want me to do." Lionel had sat with that letter for a week. He had started 4 different responses and finished none of them. He had looked at his circumstances, another season on the trail ahead of him, no permanent position yet secured with Beck, the ranch back home still struggling, his father still not fully recovered. He had looked at what he had to offer and found it wanting. He had been 24 years old, and he had made the single worst decision of his life. He had written back and told her that she should do what was best for her. He had told her that he cared for her well-being above his own wishes. He had told her, in the stiff, proud, absolutely devastating language of a young man who believed he was being noble, that he would not ask her to wait indefinitely for a future that was not yet certain. He had not said goodbye, exactly. He had said something so close to it that it amounted to the same thing. 2 months later, he had received a brief note from Margaret Wallace informing him that Emma had married Gerald Ashworth in April and that they were living in San Antonio. Lionel had folded that note into a very small square and put it in the bottom of his saddlebag, and had not spoken of it to anyone for a very long time. The years that followed were years of work. He went back to the Hill Country Ranch in 1878, having saved enough to make a real difference, and he had thrown himself into rebuilding it with the kind of obsessive focus that only makes sense when you understand that a man is trying to outwork grief. His father's health continued its slow decline, but Thomas Collier lived long enough to see the ranch become genuinely profitable. 4 years of good management, a herd that had grown to nearly 1,000 head, a new barn and a bunkhouse, and a reputation in the hill country for raising quality beef. Thomas Collier died in 1882, peacefully, in his own bed, with Lionel and Clara at his side. Clara lived on at the ranch, and Lionel worked it with 2 hands who had become something closer to family. A man named Pete Hawkins, who had been on the frontier since before the war and knew cattle, the way most men knew their own children, and a younger man named Callum Rays, whose family had worked cattle in Texas for 3 generations, and whose opinion Lionel trusted absolutely. The ranch was named Collier's Rest, which had been his father's idea, and which Lionel had kept because it felt right, a name with some peace in it, some notion of arrival. He was 34 years old and successful by the standards of 1887, and alone in the particular way that a man is alone when he has let the one person who mattered get on a different train. There had been women over the years. He was not a monk, and life on the frontier was not a monastery, but nothing that had the weight of the real thing. Nothing that made him feel the way that 2 years of Sunday porches and live oak shade and letters full of mockingbird observations had made him feel. He had not thought about Emma Ashworth in a sustained way for a long time. He had gotten quite good at not thinking about her. He had built a life and a livelihood and a house that was large enough and solid enough and entirely too quiet for one man, and he had made his peace with the idea that some things were simply in the past, done and sealed and better left undisturbed. That was the story he told himself. He told it with great consistency and some conviction. He would have gone on telling it indefinitely if not for what happened in September of 1887. Lionel had been in San Antonio for a cattle sale, a 2-week trip to conduct business with a buyer for the Beck Outfit's successor operation, and to look at a bull someone was selling out of Big Sur County. He had sold his cattle at a good price, decided against the bull, and spent the last 3 days in the city settling paperwork and having dinner with a business associate named Morton, who was a large, cheerful man who talked too much and laughed at his own stories, but whose company was not unpleasant. It was Morton who had mentioned it, on the last evening, with the casual cruelty of a man who does not know that words are explosive. He had been talking about the legal community in San Antonio, about various cases and characters, and he had said, "You heard about Gerald Ashworth, I suppose. Terrible business. Fever took him back in the spring. Left a widow and no children. She is the Wallace girl, isn't she? Robert Wallace's daughter from up in Maple Creek, though I imagine she will go back to using Wallace now." Lionel had put down his fork very carefully and asked Morton what he had said. Morton had repeated it, with slightly less enthusiasm this time, because something in Lionel's expression had made him cautious. Lionel had finished dinner with a composure that he would later consider one of his finer personal achievements, had thanked Morton for his company, had gone back to his hotel room, and had sat on the edge of the bed for approximately 40 minutes without moving. Gerald Ashworth was dead. Emma was a widow. Emma was, according to Morton, likely going back to being Emma Wallace. He did not know what to do with that information. He was 34 years old. He had made his position clear 12 years ago, or as close to clear as cowardice and misplaced nobility could make it. She had built a life. He had built a life. The idea that he could simply arrive somewhere and announce himself was absurd. It was the kind of thing that happened in the dime novels Pete Hawkins read and left around the bunkhouse, not in real life. He was on the road back to the hill country before he had finished the thought. He told himself he was simply going home. He was ready to go home. He had been in the city for 2 weeks, and the city always made him restless. He told himself that with great firmness as he collected his horse from the livery, and set out on the 4-day ride back to Redemption, the nearest town to Collier's Rest, moving through the San Antonio River Valley and northwest through the hill country with the live oaks closing in and the limestone bluffs rising on either side and the autumn light doing its particular amber alchemy on everything. He thought about Emma the entire way. He could not help it. The door that he had kept carefully shut for 12 years had been opened, not violently or dramatically, but with the devastating ordinariness of a dinner conversation, and now the light was coming through it, and he could see all the things he had stored on the other side, neatly kept and entirely unchanged. He remembered the way she had said, "Come back, Lionel," on the train platform. He had spent years trying to decide what that meant, whether it had been a declaration or a question or something in between. He thought he knew now, with the clarity that only time can give, that it had been both. She had been asking him a question and answering it simultaneously, telling him what she wanted and leaving him the freedom to choose otherwise, because that was entirely in keeping with who Emma Wallace was. He had chosen otherwise. He had been 24 and proud and afraid, and he had chosen otherwise, and then he had spent 12 years being very good at not thinking about it. He was 4 miles from Collier's Rest, moving at an easy pace through the late afternoon of the 4th day, when his horse lifted his head and snorted in the way that meant something worth noticing. Lionel looked up, and the gate of his property was visible ahead through the thinning trees, the wooden posts he had put in himself 7 years ago, solid and straight, with the iron C his father had fashioned hanging between them, and there was a figure standing at the gate. For a moment, in the slant of the late afternoon sun, he thought he was hallucinating. He blinked. The figure remained. A woman, standing quite still, with dark hair and a gray traveling coat and a small bag at her feet, and the posture of someone who has been waiting long enough to have stopped being nervous about it and arrived at a kind of determined calm. Lionel's horse stopped walking without being told. Emma Wallace turned her head and looked at him. 12 years. He had been 22 when they met and 24 when he had gotten on the train going the other way. And he was 34 now, with weather in his face and silver beginning at his temples, and she was 31. And 12 years had happened to both of them in ways that were visible and ways that were not. But her eyes were exactly the same, dark and intelligent, and turning things over, examining them, coming to conclusions with a deliberateness that had always made him feel both seen and slightly unnerved. He dismounted. He was not certain his legs were going to work correctly, but they did, and he walked the rest of the way to the gate with his horse's reins in his hand and the evening light pouring gold over everything. "Emma," he said. "Lionel," she said. Her voice was steady, though he could see, when he was close enough, that her hands were not entirely. She had them clasped in front of her with a firmness that suggested active effort. He stopped on his side of the gate. She was on the outside, which struck him as odd and then as perfectly appropriate, and he reached out and unlatched it, swinging it open, and stood there with it open between them. "I heard about Gerald," he said, because he had to say something, and this was the honest place to start. "I am sorry for your loss." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, not pain exactly, but something complicated and considered. "Thank you," she said. "He was not a bad man. He was decent and fair, and I respected him. I want you to know that." "I am glad to hear it," Lionel said, and meant it, because Emma's pain was his pain and had been for a long time, even when he wasn't paying attention to it. There was a silence. A mockingbird called from somewhere in the live oaks, 3 different songs in quick succession, as if trying to fill the space. "I did not know where else to go," Emma said. Her voice did not crack, but it was close to it. "My father passed 2 years ago. My mother is with my sister in Georgia. I spent 7 months in San Antonio after Gerald died, and I was very alone there, Lionel. I did not belong to that city. I never did, and I thought about coming here." She paused. "I thought about coming here for a long time before I actually did it. I want you to know that too. I did not come on impulse. I thought about it very carefully." "How long have you been waiting at this gate?" he asked. The corners of her mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. "Since this morning. I came in on the stage to Redemption last night and stayed at the boarding house, and I rode out here this morning on a horse I hired from the livery, and I left it there tied to the fence post, which I hope is acceptable." Lionel looked at the fence post and saw that there was, in fact, a bay mare tied there with her head down, eating the long grass at the base of the post. He nodded slowly. He felt as though he were made of something very precarious, like a structure assembled from dry wood in a high wind, holding together through sheer concentrated effort. "You could have written," he said. "I did not know what to say in a letter," she said. "I did not know how to explain what I wanted to say in a letter. I had to come and say it to your face." "And what did you want to say?" Emma Wallace looked at him across the open gate for a long, sustained moment, and something in her expression resolved itself, and she said, "That I have never stopped loving you, that I understood why you said what you said in that letter, and I forgave you for it a very long time ago. That I spent 12 years married to a decent man in a city I did not belong to, and I was faithful and I tried and I was not unhappy, but I was not right either, and I think you know what I mean by that. And that I am 31 years old and I have come to the place where I am no longer interested in waiting to see what happens. I am too old for that and too tired of it. So I came here to ask you directly, Lionel Collier, whether you still feel for me what I believe you did 12 years ago, because if you do not, I will understand it and I will leave and I will find my own way forward. But if you do, I would very much like to know it." The evening light was doing something extraordinary by this point, the hill country autumn turning the whole visible world to copper and gold, the live oaks throwing long shadows across the limestone, the mockingbird still conducting its complicated recital somewhere in the branches. Lionel stood at his open gate and looked at Emma Wallace and felt the 12 years fold up like a map, that has been open too long on a table, everything collapsing into the single point where things had always been heading. "I have never stopped loving you either," he said, "not for a single day. I told you to go because I was proud and afraid and I thought I was doing right by you, and I have spent 12 years knowing that I was wrong. I am sorry for it, Emma. I am deeply sorry," she breathed out. It was a long, slow breath, the kind that carries a great deal with it, and her hands unclenched from their careful clasp, and she looked like a woman who has put down something very heavy. "Then we are agreed," she said. "We are agreed," he said. He stepped back from the gate, an invitation, and Emma Wallace picked up her small bag and walked through it and into his yard. She stayed that night at the main house in a condition of perfect respectability. Clara Collier was in residence, and Clara, who had known Emma years before and had always approved of her in the quiet, thorough way of women who judge character rather than circumstance, had received her with an embrace that said everything that did not need to be said aloud. Pete Hawkins and Callum Rays had been introduced at supper, and had both been impeccably mannered. Pete because he was always mannered with women, and Callum because he had taken one look at Lionel's face when he came through the door with Emma and had correctly assessed the situation. The supper itself was a revelation. Clara cooked, which she rarely did anymore. She had a housekeeper now, a stout woman named Rosa who was a formidable cook in her own right. But Clara cooked that evening herself, venison and beans and cornbread and dried apple pie, and Emma sat at the table and talked to Clara about Georgia and about the hill country and about books she had read, and Clara talked back. And Lionel sat at the head of his father's table and watched this, and felt something settle inside him that had not been settled in a very long time. After supper, he and Emma sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, and the stars came out over the hill country in the particular excessive abundance that only happened out here, away from town lights, the Milky Way a broad river overhead. "Tell me what the years were like," Emma said. "All of them. I want to know." He told her. He told her about the trail drives in Beck and the long roads and the difficult river crossings and the men he had worked beside. He told her about coming home and rebuilding, about the grief of watching his father diminish, and the particular satisfaction of the ranch, becoming what his father had always hoped it could be. He told her about Pete and Callum and the rhythms of the hill country seasons. He told her about the loneliness, because she had asked for all of it and it would be dishonest to leave that out. She told him her years in exchange. She told him about San Antonio, not unkindly but honestly. Gerald Ashworth had been an intelligent man with a good practice and a fine house, and he had treated her with respect and consideration. There had been genuine affection, if not passion. They had lost a baby in the second year, a boy, born too early, who had not survived. And the loss had been a grief that Emma had carried alone because Gerald, though kind, was not a man who could sit in grief with someone, and she had never entirely let herself stop carrying it. She had read and she had organized charitable efforts, and she had managed the house, and she had been, she said, a perfectly adequate wife to a perfectly adequate man, and it had been a perfectly adequate life. And she had come to see that perfectly adequate was a category of description that ought not to apply to a life. Gerald had fallen ill in February. The fever had taken him fast 10 days from the first symptom to the end, and there had been no children to help her through it. And the friends in San Antonio had been Gerald's friends first and had been kind but brief in their condolences. And she had stood in that fine house in that city that was not hers, and she had thought about what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. "I thought about writing you," she said, "dozens of times. But every time I sat down to write, I did not know how to begin, and I thought that perhaps you had moved on, that perhaps you had a wife and children and a full life, and that arriving in it would be a disruption and a cruelty." "I do not have a wife," Lionel said. "I have not come close to having a wife. I know that now. I made inquiries in Redemption before I rode out here. I asked at the boarding house, and the proprietress told me that Lionel Collier had been a bachelor for all the time she had known of him, and that he was a serious, solitary, respectable man who ran a fine ranch and did not make trouble. She paused. She also said you were handsome, which I already knew. Lionel looked at her and Emma looked at him, and they both laughed, a real laugh, the kind that releases something, and in the aftermath of it, without any particular decision being made about it. His hand found hers on the porch rail, and she turned her hand over to hold it properly. They sat like that for a long time in the hill country dark, and it was the closest to peace that either of them had been in 12 years. The days that followed were careful ones, because they were both adults who had been through things, and because the frontier in 1887 was a place with its own codes of conduct, and because Clara Collier was there and maintained a watchful benevolence over the household that was simultaneously comforting and slightly inhibiting. Emma was given the room that had been the guest room since the new house was built, a proper room with a real bed and a window that looked out toward the east pasture, where the cattle could be seen in the mornings, moving in their slow, purposeful way through the long grass. She stayed for a week, and then another week, and at the end of the second week, Lionel rode into Redemption and had a conversation with Pastor Elias Brandt of the First Methodist Church, which was the most straightforward conversation he had ever had in his life. He told the pastor that he wanted to marry Emma Wallace, that Emma was a widow of 7 months, that she was a respectable woman of good character, and he was a man of some property and known standing in the community, and that he wanted to know what the pastor thought about the prospect of a wedding in, say, 3 weeks. Pastor Brandt, who was a tall, mild man with a gray beard and the slightly distracted air of someone who is always composing a sermon in the back of his mind, had said that 3 weeks was perfectly reasonable and that he would be glad to read the banns. Lionel had ridden back to Collier's Rest considerably lighter than he had left it. He had proposed to Emma that evening, not with any great ceremony, because neither of them was inclined toward ceremony, but with the directness that they had always shared, sitting on the same porch they had been sitting on for 2 weeks, in the cooling autumn air. He had told her what he had done and what he had said to the pastor, and then he had said, "I am asking you to marry me, Emma. I am asking you to stay here if you are willing to and build a life with me. I believe I can make you happy. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time trying." Emma had looked at him for the familiar long moment of consideration, and then she had said, "Yes. I am going to say yes this time without any qualifications or hesitations, because I am 31 years old and I have learned the cost of hesitation." He had kissed her then for the first time properly, and it had been something that he would remember in detail for the rest of his life, the autumn air carrying the smell of cedar and dried grass, the stars appearing one by one overhead, Emma's hands against his face like an answer. Clara, who had been inside doing absolutely nothing near the front window, had smiled to herself and gone to make tea. The 3 weeks before the wedding were busy. Emma wrote to her sister in Georgia with the news, and her sister Margaret, named for their mother, who had passed the previous year, wrote back with what Emma described as great enthusiasm and some mild hysteria, promising to come west as soon as she was able, though she could not make it in time for the wedding itself. Emma ordered a dress from the seamstress in Redemption, a woman named Adela Voss who was brisk and competent, and who declared Emma's measurements ideal and the timeline challenging, and who delivered in the end a dress of dove gray silk that was simple and lovely and entirely right. Lionel, for his part, had a new suit made by the tailor, submitted to Pete Hawkins's opinion on the boots, and spent several evenings sitting with Clara, who was in the particular state of emotional readiness that mothers of adult children inhabit when the children are finally doing something right. "She is what I always hoped for you," Clara said to him one evening, in the frank way she had. "I want you to know that I knew it when you were 22 years old, and I know it now. You are both people who take things seriously. That is the foundation of a good marriage." "I should have gone back sooner," Lionel said. "You should have," Clara agreed without any softening. But you are here now and she is here now and you are both still yourselves, which is more than can be said for some people. Do not spend too much time on what you should have done. It takes your attention away from what you can do. It was the best piece of advice anyone had ever given him. The wedding was held on the third Saturday of October, 1887, in the First Methodist Church of Redemption, which was a white-painted building with a small steeple and a yard full of live oak trees that were just beginning their autumn turn. Pastor Brandt officiated. Clara sat in the front pew and did not cry, though her handkerchief was in her hand throughout. Pete Hawkins stood up with Lionel, having cleaned up to a degree that impressed everyone present, including Pete himself. Callum Reyes attended with his wife Louisa and their 3 children, who sat in the pew with the precision of children who have been firmly instructed on conduct and are determined to prove the instruction took. The town of Redemption turned out to a notable degree, because weddings were events, and because Lionel Collier was known and liked, and because word had gotten around that the woman he was marrying had ridden out to his gate alone and waited there all day for him. And this detail had passed through the town with the speed and embellishment that characterized all good frontier news, so that by the time of the wedding, various versions existed involving anything from a week's wait to the woman having ridden from San Antonio on horseback, without stopping. The actual story was better than any of the embellishments, but Emma, who heard several versions of it when she went into town for errands, had found it quietly amusing rather than irritating, which was one of the signs of a woman secure in her own truth. Emma Wallace came down the aisle of the First Methodist Church on her own, because her father was gone and her brother-in-law could not be there in time, and she did it with the same unhurried grace that had knocked Lionel Collier into a shelf of tin cans in a general store 12 years before. And when she reached the front and stood beside him and turned to look at him, his face was the face of a man who has come home after a very long journey and recognized the place. The vows were the standard Methodist ones, promised in the direct, plain language that fitted both of them. When Lionel said, "I do," it was not loud, but it was absolute. The way the things he meant were always absolute. When Emma said, "I do," she was looking at him with the full attention of those dark eyes, and Pastor Brandt, who had married a great many people over his career and had a fair ability to read what was real, thought to himself that he had rarely seen 2 people more precisely where they were supposed to be. Clara cried on the way out of the church. She had made it all the way through the service. The celebration afterward was held at the Redemption Town Hall, a large room attached to the courthouse that served as a general community space, and that had been decorated by a committee of women including Rosa, Louisa Reyes, and the formidable Mrs. Harker, who organized every public event in Redemption with the efficiency of a military campaign. There was food in quantities that suggested the committee had anticipated the whole of Bixar County arriving, and a fiddle player from the edge of town named Old Theo, who could play anything from a hymn to a reel, and who played both that evening. Lionel danced with Emma twice and with Clara once, and Emma danced with Pete Hawkins, who turned out to be a surprisingly capable dancer, and with Callum Reyes, and even briefly with Pastor Brandt, who was less surprising but equally earnest. Late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and Old Theo was playing something slow and sweet, Lionel found Emma standing near the window with a cup of punch in her hand, looking out at the dark hill country with a particular expression on her face that he was learning to read. She was thinking, turning something over, arriving at conclusions. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and smiled a real, full smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes, the kind he had spent 12 years keeping in the back of his mind as a reference point for what genuine happiness looked like. "I am thinking that I should have gone to find you a great deal sooner," she said, and also that it would have been the wrong time a great deal sooner, and that everything has happened at the right moment, even if the right moment took longer than it should have. She paused. And I am thinking that I am very happy, Lionel, genuinely and completely. I want you to know that. He took the punch cup out of her hand, set it on the windowsill, and kissed her in the lamplight of the Redemption Town Hall, with Theo's fiddle playing something slow and sweet, and the hill country dark outside the window. And the people who saw it were not offended, because they could see plainly that it was not a casual thing. They went home to Collier's Rest that night, husband and wife, under a sky full of stars. The months that followed were the months of settling into a shared life, which is a project that requires both of them to be paying attention, and both of them were. Emma took to the ranch with a thoroughness that surprised no one who knew her. She had grown up adjacent to the frontier, even if Maple Creek had been a town of some refinement by hill country standards, and she was not fragile or ornamental, or given to finding things difficult without good reason. She learned the rhythms of the cattle operation, learned to read the weather signs that Pete Hawkins read, developed her own opinions about which of the hands were reliable and which required watching, and maintained a correspondence with her sister in Georgia that was clearly a sustaining thread for both of them. She also brought books, a whole trunk of them, and they appeared on the shelf in the main room and in the bedroom and on the kitchen table. And when Lionel came in from the range in the evenings, Emma was often reading, and would look up with the specific expression of someone interrupted mid-thought, and then would put the book down and give him her full attention, which he appreciated more than he could adequately say. Clara Collier, who had been quietly and determinedly solitary since Thomas's death, bloomed in the presence of another woman in the household. She and Emma established a friendship that Lionel watched with enormous satisfaction. Two intelligent, opinionated, practical women who had, in the words of Pete Hawkins, apparently been waiting to meet each other for years. They disagreed sometimes, loudly and with evident enjoyment, about matters ranging from the best method for preserving fruit to the land policies of the Texas state government, and they always reached an agreement eventually, or agreed to disagree with mutual respect, and Lionel noted that the house was louder and warmer than it had ever been. Pete Hawkins, who was 53 and had spent his life on the frontier and had never married, observed all of this from a comfortable philosophical distance, and was heard to remark to Callum Rays that there was something to be said for coming home after all. In the spring of 1888, Emma told Lionel that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning in the direct way that she handled all significant information. She simply said it, looking at him steadily, waiting to see how he received it. He had received it by crossing the kitchen in 3 steps and holding her face in both his hands and saying nothing at all for a moment, because there were no words that were adequate. She had leaned her forehead against his and closed her eyes, and they had stood like that in the kitchen light while the coffee boiled. The memory of the child she had lost in San Antonio was present for both of them throughout the pregnancy, unspoken but acknowledged in the care they both took, in the way Emma rested more than she might otherwise have chosen to, in the way Lionel rode into Redemption more than once to consult with Dr. Miles Fenwick, who was the town's doctor and a careful, competent man who had delivered a considerable portion of the hill country population. "She is strong," Dr. Fenwick told Lionel in August, "and the child is positioned well, and I have every reason to believe all will go well. But I understand your concern, and I want you to know that I will come when you send for me, no matter the hour." The baby came on a clear September morning in 1888, a boy, born after a long labor that tested Emma's considerable reserves of determination, delivered by Dr. Fenwick with Clara at Emma's side and Lionel in the hallway outside, doing the particular kind of pacing that is less about the distance covered and more about the need for motion. Pete Hawkins sat on the porch and whittled something that ended up being unrecognizable, and Callum Ray's had ridden over on some pretext and was sitting with Pete, and both of them were listening to the sounds of the house, with the alert calm of men trying to be steady about something that was making them anxious. When Dr. Fenwick opened the door and told Lionel that Emma was well and that he had a son, Lionel sat down in the hallway for a moment, which he had not intended to do. He heard Pete Hawkins let out a long breath on the porch. He heard Clara saying something in the room in that particular low, warm voice she used for things that mattered. He went in. Emma was in the bed with the look of someone who has accomplished something extremely difficult and is both exhausted and satisfied about it. She was holding the boy, who was red-faced and serious and had very dark hair and was squinting at the world with the expression of a person who has just arrived somewhere unfamiliar and is taking stock. Lionel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and Emma watched his face with an expression that contained many things at once: love and pride and a little amusement and the particular depth of feeling that does not have a precise name. "He looks serious," Lionel said. "He looks exactly like you," Emma said. He had not intended to cry. He was a composed man by temperament and practice. He cried. They named the boy Thomas Robert Collier Thomas for Lionel's father, Robert for Emma's, and the combination struck both of them as right. Clara, when told the name, had to go to the kitchen for a few minutes. She came back with red eyes and the firmness of a woman who has had her feelings and is now proceeding. The boy was called Tom from the beginning, and he was from the beginning a child who seemed to understand that he was surrounded by a great deal of love, which gave him a quality of security and easiness that made him pleasant company even as an infant. The year of Tom's infancy was a good one. The ranch had its best season yet. A wet spring had meant strong grazing, and the cattle prices held, and Lionel made the decision in the fall to purchase an additional section of land to the north that had come available when the family that had been trying to farm it had given up and gone back east. The land was limestone heavy, but had a reliable water source and good shade, and he had been wanting it for 2 years, and having it felt like another piece of the ranch clicking into place. Emma had her sister Margaret visit in the winter of 1888, arriving by train to San Antonio, and then by stage to Redemption in the company of her husband William and their 2 daughters. And the house at Collier's Rest was full to capacity and loud for 2 weeks, and Lionel discovered that he liked William, who was a dry, intelligent man with a good sense of humor and a genuine curiosity about ranch life. And that Margaret was enough like Emma to make him understand the family clearly, and enough, unlike her, to make the friendship between the sisters interesting. Margaret held Tom at great length and declared him magnificent, which he was, and she cried when she and Emma were together in the kitchen alone, and she thought Lionel could not hear them, and he stepped quietly away from that conversation because it was not his. Life on the frontier in the late 1880s was never entirely smooth. There were hard seasons, a dry summer in 1889 that tested the water sources and required moving cattle and making difficult choices about the herd. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Ord Morrison, who was a difficult man with expansive ideas about where his property line was, that required Lionel to hire a lawyer from San Antonio and spend 3 months in a careful, expensive negotiation that ultimately resolved in Collier's favor, but left a cold peace between the 2 properties. There was a fire in the barn in the spring of 1890, started by a lantern that had not been properly secured, found and contained before it spread to the house, but costly in the lost hay and the need to rebuild. Pete Hawkins broke his leg that fall, which kept him off horseback for the better part of 2 months, and required Lionel to bring in a temporary hand, and for Pete to spend his days in a state of grumpy recuperation that Emma managed with such good-natured firmness that Pete declared, from his chair by the window, that she was the best nurse and the most relentless woman he had ever encountered, and he meant both as the highest compliments. Through all of it, the dry seasons and the legal disputes and the fire and the broken leg, and the thousand daily demanding details of running a working cattle ranch in the hill country. Lionel and Emma operated as a unit with a coherence that came from genuinely understanding each other. They did not always agree. They argued sometimes, with the real engagement of two people who respect each other too much to pretend, and they always found their way through the argument to the thing that mattered, which was that they were together, and they had chosen each other, and they were not willing to let any question, however pressing, come between them permanently. In the evenings, after Tom was asleep and Clara had retired and Pete had retreated to the bunkhouse and the ranch was quiet, they sat together on the porch that faced the sunset, and they talked about the day, about the ranch, about the books Emma was reading, about the state of Texas politics and the question of the land and the way the frontier was changing as the railroads pushed further into every corner, and the open range began its long compression. They talked about the people who had shaped them, including the ones who were gone. They talked about Tom, who was becoming a small person of distinct character, curious and earnest, and already showing a notable inclination toward horses. These evenings were the thing that Lionel would have found impossible to describe to anyone who had not experienced them. The specific texture of sitting on a porch in the hill country dark with the person you love most in the world, talking about nothing in particular, feeling the day settle around you. It was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was real. Emma, for her part, wrote about it in the journal she had kept since she was 16. The journal that had survived the train platforms and the San Antonio years, and the journey to redemption in her traveling bag, the journal that was now on its 4th volume. She wrote about Lionel with the same careful attention she gave everything, trying to get him exactly right in language, and she was not sure she ever entirely succeeded because he was the kind of person whose essential quality was not in words but in presence, in the particular quality of attention he gave to things, in the way he moved through the world with a seriousness that was not heaviness, a steadiness that was not stillness. She wrote in the Journal of 1889, "I think the error of my younger years was believing that love was a feeling to be arrived at, a destination one reached and then inhabited unchanged forever. It is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily choosing, a continued attention. I choose Lionel Collier every morning when I wake up in this house in the hill country, and he chooses me, and we have been choosing each other for 2 years now, and the choosing does not diminish. It increases. Every year I know him better and love him more specifically, which is the only kind of love I believe in entirely." She did not show him this passage. She told him most of it, eventually in pieces, in conversation on the porch or across the kitchen table, and he received it with the seriousness it deserved. Emma was expecting again by the summer of 1890, which Dr. Fenwick received with his usual measured reassurance, and Clara received with unmistakable delight. Tom, who was nearly 2, was introduced to the concept of a coming sibling in terms he could partially understand, and he showed his engagement with the idea by patting Emma's midsection with a proprietary air that made her laugh every time. The second child arrived in February of 1891. Another boy. They had half expected a girl this time and were pleasantly surprised. Born easier than Tom had been and arriving into the world, with a notable volume that suggested strong lungs and opinions. They named him James William Collier, James for no one in particular, because they liked the name, William for Emma's brother-in-law, who had become a genuine friend over the years. James was, from the beginning, entirely different from Tom. Where Tom was thoughtful and careful, James was immediate and enthusiastic, a child who threw himself at the world with a completeness that was both delightful and exhausting. He walked early, ran before he was fully stable at walking, and had strong preferences about everything from food to which person held him. Lionel, watching his 2 sons together in the evenings, Tom serious and attentive, James, perpetually in motion, felt a fullness in his chest that he had no adequate language for. Pete Hawkins, who had recovered fully from his leg and was back to his full range of operations, had by this point formed such a strong attachment to both boys that he was essentially a third grandfather, something he approached with touching solemnity, given that he was a man who had spent most of his life on the frontier and had not expected to end up in this situation. He taught Tom to recognize horses by temperament before the boy was old enough for any formal riding instruction. He made James a small wooden horse that James loved ferociously and carried everywhere until it was more worn than wood. Callum and Louisa Rays were part of the extended family of the ranch in a way that was never formal but was entirely real. Their children grew alongside Tom and James, and Sunday meals at Collier's Rest became a standing tradition that included the Rays family without any particular arrangement being made about it. It was simply understood that if you were near the ranch on a Sunday, you ate there, and there was always food. Clara Collier, who had lived with the quiet grief of Thomas's death for years, had arrived at a peace with it that was visible in her daily contentment. She watched her grandchildren and she talked to Emma, and she corresponded with her sister in East Texas, and she read her own books, and she declared, at the age of 64, that she had no intention of going anywhere, that this was her house and her family, and that was entirely sufficient for her. She did, eventually, develop the cough that Thomas had developed after the fever, and Dr. Fenwick watched it with care, and it was not the quick, merciful end that some feared but a slow diminishment that went on for 2 years before Clara passed in the winter of 1893, at the age of 66, in her own room with the window open, because she had always preferred cold air when she slept. Lionel sat with her for the last day, and Emma sat on the other side, and Clara's last clear conversation had been with Emma, the two of them talking about the mockingbirds, of all things, whether they migrated or stayed through the hill country winters, a question that Clara had apparently been considering for some time, and that Emma promised to find out the answer to, a promise that made Clara smile. The grief of Clara's loss was real and it was carried. The house was quieter without her. The gaps were felt. But the house was also full of Tom, who was 5 and already helping with minor ranch tasks with an earnestness that would have made his grandfather proud, and James, who was 2 and into everything, and the living and the daily work were sustaining in the way that living and daily work always are when they are chosen and loved. Emma wrote the letter to Margaret about Clara's passing, and Margaret wrote back with such warmth and practical sympathy that Emma read the letter 3 times and then folded it away in the drawer where she kept letters she needed to keep. Margaret and William came that spring, and their visit was partly condolence and partly the ordinary pleasure of their company, and William and Lionel rode the range together one afternoon and talked about everything except the things they were actually feeling, in the way that men do when they are genuinely connected to each other and not yet quite practiced at saying so. The ranch continued to grow. By 1894, Collier's Rest was carrying 1,200 head on land that now stretched across 3 sections of the hill country, with a bunkhouse that housed 6 permanent hands and a reputation in the region for quality beef and straight dealing. Lionel had entered his 40s with the quality of a man who has found his work and his place and his people, and is exercising all of his abilities in their service. He was not particularly interested in politics or in the expanding world of commerce that the railroads were bringing to Texas, but he was interested in the land and the people on it, and he was known as a fair employer and a reliable neighbor, which were the things that mattered in a community like Redemption. Emma had, by this point, become a force in the town in her own right, not through any formal position, because the formal positions available to women in 1894 Texas were limited, but through the particular influence of a woman who is intelligent and present and genuinely concerned with the people around her. She had helped establish a lending library in Redemption, talking the mayor and 3 of the leading businesses into providing the space and some of the funding, and then organizing the book donations herself with characteristic thoroughness. She wrote for the Redemption Gazette occasionally articles about frontier life and land management, and the importance of education that were well received and sometimes controversial, and always worth reading. She helped Louisa Reyes navigate a difficult situation when one of the Reyes' hands was cheated by a merchant in town, using her knowledge of the law gained from growing up in a lawyer's house to make clear to the merchant that the matter could be escalated if it was not resolved, and it was resolved. She was also in 1895 expecting again, a surprise and a joy and a subject of considerable interest to Tom, who was 7 and had strong opinions, and James, who was 4 and whose primary concern was whether he could name the new baby. The third child was a girl. She arrived in November of 1895, after the easiest labor of the 3, and she was placed in Lionel's arms first while Emma recovered, which was a thing he had not expected, and he stood in the room with this small, serious, dark-eyed person looking up at him, and felt 12 years of history and 12 years of the life since close around him into a single coherent thing. "What does James want to name her?" Emma asked from the bed, her voice rough but her eyes alert and warm. "When I last asked him, he wanted to name her Biscuit," Lionel said. Emma laughed, which she had not expected to be doing quite this soon, and winced and laughed again. They named her Clara, for the grandmother she would not know, with Emma's middle name as her second name. Clara Emma Collier was called Clary from her first week, primarily because James could not say Clara and Clary stuck, and she was a child who seemed to have arrived with a complete personality already installed, opinionated, decisive, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's steady composure, and a particular smile that combined both and was entirely her own. Tom was a devoted older brother to Clary in the protective, responsible way of eldest children who have taken the role seriously. James adored her with the uncomplicated totality that was his approach to everything he loved. Lionel watched his children together with Emma beside him, standing at the fence of the home pasture where Tom was showing James and Clary how to approach a horse calmly, and he thought of the train platform in Maple Creek in 1875, and the letter in Abilene in 1877, and the figure at the gate in 1887, and the road between those points was clear to him. Every wrong turn and every right one, every choice made in pride or fear or love. All of it leading to this pasture in the hill country afternoon. Emma's hand found his on the fence rail. She had a habit of doing that, finding his hand, not with any fanfare or announcement, simply locating it and holding it, the way you locate something you need and keep it where you can reach it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am glad you came to that gate," he said. "I am glad you came home when you did," she said. "If you had been another day, I might have had a very different conversation with the horse I hired from the livery about whether to give up and go back to San Antonio." "You would not have gone back to San Antonio," he said. She looked at him, and that expression was on her face, the one that turned things over and came to conclusions, the one he had been reading for nearly 20 years now and still found entirely absorbing. "No," she said, "I would not have, but it is nice to be certain of that looking back." "You were always certain," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "You are the only person I know who manages to be both," he said. She smiled at him, the full smile that reached her eyes, and he felt it the same way he had felt it on the porch in 1887, and the church in Redemption, and the kitchen the morning she told him about Tom, and every day in between as something essential, something that oriented him like the North Star orients a rider in the dark. Tom had gotten James and Clary all the way to the fence where the horses were grazing, and was explaining something with great seriousness. And James was listening with his whole body, and Clary was watching the horses with the intense focus she brought to everything new. And Pete Hawkins was sitting on the water trough with his hat pushed back, watching them and looking satisfied. The sun was doing its hill country afternoon thing, the light going honey gold through the live oaks, the limestone catching it and holding it, the distant bluffs going copper against a sky that was the particular clear blue of a Texas fall. Lionel Collier stood at the fence of his own land with his wife's hand in his, watching his children learn the world. 12 years of absence resolved into presence. 12 years of a closed door resolved into this open pasture. And the thing he felt was not complicated or confused or shadowed by anything unfinished. It was the thing he had been working toward for 34 years, and the last 12 of them had been the truest and the best. And he understood completely that the goodbye on the train platform and the letter in Abilene and all the years of solitary work had been the long way to this exact place. And he would not have altered it, could not have altered it, because every piece of it had made them who they were when they found each other again. In the evenings on the porch, looking out at the hill country dark, he told her this once. He told it carefully, because he did not want to suggest that her years with Gerald or the loss she had carried from San Antonio were simple or purposeful suffering, because he did not believe that. He was saying something more specific, that the people they were when she walked through his gate were people who had earned each other, who had lived enough of their own lives to know the full weight of what they were choosing. Emma had listened to all of it with the full attention that was her gift, and then she had been quiet for a moment. And then she had said that she thought he was right about most of it, but that she was also going to spend a reasonable amount of time believing that they might have done perfectly well if they had never been separated at all, because she did not want to romanticize the years she had spent not having this. He had agreed that this was entirely fair. They had sat together in the dark with the mockingbirds finally quiet in the live oaks, and the cattle settled in the home pasture, and the children asleep in the house, and the hill country breathing around them. And the piece of it was so complete and so earned that it needed no improvement and no addition, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not say better. The years continued in that way, full and working and real. Tom grew into a young man of 16 by 1904, who could handle cattle and horses and the basic business of the ranch, with a competence that made Lionel look at him, sometimes with the particular pride of a father who recognizes in his child a capability that exceeds his own expectations. James at 13 was still enthusiastic and immediate, but had added to these qualities a sharpness about people and situations that made him someone you wanted beside you in a negotiation or a difficult conversation. Clary at 9 was the most clearly her mother's daughter in the way she read everything in sight and argued about what she had read with anyone willing to engage, which in the household of Collier's Rest was everyone, because they were all, by temperament and by Emma's long influence, willing to argue about ideas. Pete Hawkins had retired from active ranch work in 1901, at the age of 67, but had not left. He had simply shifted from being a hand to being something more like the ranch's conscience and historian, spending his days between the bunkhouse and the porch and the barn and the various conversations that found him there. He taught Tom things about cattle and weather and people with the steady generosity of a man giving away what he knew before he was done knowing it. Callum Ray's had taken a greater role in running the operation by this point, and there had been a formal arrangement made in 1900 that gave Callum a partnership share in the ranch, a thing that Lionel had proposed because it was right, and that Callum had accepted after long consideration, because he had made the hill country his home, and the Collier operation his work, and the arrangement that existed between them was already a partnership in everything but name. Louisa Reyes had expressed her view on this development by cooking a feast that fed everyone on both properties for 2 days. There had been a conversation in 1896, the year after Clary was born, that had resolved a long-standing and unspoken tension in the community around redemption. It had been about the treatment of the Mexican families in the area, The Ray's family and others who had been in the hill country since before Texas was Texas, who had found themselves marginalized and squeezed by the expansion of Anglo settlement, their land claims disputed or simply not honored. Lionel had spoken at the town council meeting about it, not as an act of grand politics, but because Callum was his partner and his friend, and what was happening was not right, and the two of them had gone together, and Emma had come as well and had spoken with the precision of someone who had spent her childhood watching her father argue law and had never forgotten the lessons. They had not solved anything systemic that evening. The injustices that had been built into the structure of Texas land and law over decades were not going to be resolved in a single town meeting. But they had made clear where they stood, and other voices had joined theirs, and the particular piece of it that involved the recognition of the Ray's family's established claims was addressed and recorded, which was something. Callum had said, on the ride home, that it was not enough and he knew they knew it was not enough. And Lionel had said that knowing it was not enough and stopping were two different things. And Callum had nodded once, and that had been the end of that conversation, and the beginning of a longer one that continued across the following years. Emma had written about it in the Gazette, and the article had been printed and had been forwarded to a paper in San Antonio, and had been read more widely than anything she had written before. It had brought her some unpleasant correspondence and some admiring correspondence, and she had responded to both kinds with the same measured directness, which was her way. The 19th century ended and the 20th began, and the world was changing. The railroad had come close enough to redemption that the drives to distant markets were no longer necessary, and the automobile was appearing in the cities though not yet in the hill country, and the Texas frontier as it had existed in the 1870s and 1880s was giving way to something different. Something that was still recognizably Texas, but had lost some of the particular wildness that had shaped the people who had lived in it. Lionel felt this as a kind of large weather change, something you could not stop and perhaps should not want to stop, but that you wanted to have seen clearly and to have been honest about while it was happening. He talked about it with Emma, who felt it too, who had written about it and who understood it in the way of someone who had arrived in the hill country as an outsider and had chosen it entirely, which gave her a perspective that was different from those who had been born into it. On an evening in the autumn of 1905, Lionel and Emma sat on the porch at Collier's Rest that faced the sunset, the same porch they had sat on since 1887, rebuilt once when the boards had needed it, solid and familiar. Tom was 17 and had ridden out to the north section that morning and would be back by dark. James was 14 and was in the barn with Pete, who had recently decided that the barn needed reorganizing and had conscripted James as his assistant. Clary was 9 and was inside reading at a speed that suggested she had inherited Emma's relationship with books without any of the natural governors. The hill country sunset was doing what it always did, the light going through its amber and copper sequence, the live oaks going dark against it, the limestone bluffs catching the last of it and holding it in the particular way of limestone, warm and ancient. "I want to tell you something," Emma said. "Tell me," he said. "I want to tell you that this is the life I would have chosen," she said. "If someone had shown me all of the possible lives and said, 'Choose, this is the one. This ranch, this land, this family, this man.'" She paused. "I am not saying that only because it is what I have. I am saying it because I know the difference, having had something else for a time, and this is the one I would have chosen." Lionel sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with something you want to receive properly. "I have not always been easy to love," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are proud and you hold things in and you occasionally make decisions about what is best for people without asking the people. But you are honest and you are loyal and you work hard at the right things and you are a good father and you love me well. And the not easy parts are things I know how to navigate, which is the advantage of knowing someone properly." He looked at her, 31 on that gate, 49 now, with the years in her face the way the years are in the face of a woman who has lived outdoors and in full weather, with her dark eyes as alive as they had ever been, and that quality of unhurried consideration entirely unchanged. She was the most complete person he had ever known. He had known it at 22 in a general store, and he knew it now with 18 years of evidence to support the knowledge. "You are the best thing in my life," he said. It was not eloquent. It did not need to be. Emma looked at him with those dark eyes and smiled, and it was the smile from the porch in 1887, the one that reached all the way up, and it had not changed either, and it still did to him what it had always done. Tom rode in from the north section as the last of the light left the sky, his horse's hooves on the dry ground, a sound that Lionel had come to know the way he knew all the sounds of the ranch, the texture of it, the meaning in it. James came out of the barn with Pete, the two of them deep in some conversation about the reorganized barn that James was apparently enthusiastic about, in a way that indicated he had done a significant amount of the work. Clary appeared at the front door with her book still in her hand to announce that supper was going to be ready in 15 minutes, a message presumably relayed from Rosa in the kitchen, delivered with the authority of someone who has been appointed official announcer. The household settled into the evening motion, horses put up, hands washed, the smell of Rosa's cooking coming through the windows, the sounds of a family preparing for the end of the day with the familiarity of long practice. Lionel and Emma stayed on the porch for another few minutes after Clary had gone back inside, watching the hill country go to full dark. "Come back, Lionel," she had said on the platform in 1875. He had gotten on the train. He had gone the wrong way for longer than either of them should have accepted. He had come back. She had come to the gate. The gate was always open now. He rose from his chair and held out his hand, and Emma took it, and they went inside together to their children and their supper and the warm, crowded, particular life they had made in the hill country, the life that was exactly what it was supposed to be, fully closed and fully theirs and entirely enough.